Welcome to Pure Nonfiction, the podcast interviewing documentary filmmakers. I'm your host, Tom Powers. On this episode, I talked to Roger Ross Williams. He was the first African-American director to ever win an Oscar for his short film Music by Prudence in 2010. You may remember his acceptance speech when he was Kanye'd by his producer, who interrupted him. We'll talk more about that later. He went on to make God Loves Uganda, about American evangelicals stirring up homophobia in Africa. His new film is Life Animated, looking at a family learning to communicate with their autistic son through the dialogue of Disney movies. Life Animated has been winning acclaim at film festivals. I sat down with Roger during his stop at the Montclair Film Festival in April and conducted this interview in my New Jersey basement. Roger started his career working in network news. I asked him how he made the transition to documentaries.
So I was working for network news and I hated my job.
What do you think it was going to be like when you went into it?
I thought we would actually be doing stories that mattered. I thought journalism was still alive, and journalism is pretty much dead, especially in the mainstream media, and I was really disappointed. And
so this is when did you have this job or these jobs?
Pretty much, I graduated from NYU, and I've spent pretty much about 15 years working in network news. And there was a point where CNN I was working for CNN, and they decided that I had this sort of filmmaker instinct, so they would send me out to make these little films. And I remember I made a little film where I was following George W. Bush as he was campaigning for the primary in South Carolina. And I made this little verite film that they loved, but then I got a call from the president of CNN. He said, makes George W. Bush look too bad, and CNN is already accused of being liberal media, and wow. I'm friends with the Clintons. You have to tone it down. I was like, but that's, he did scream. He would scream at reporters, and he would be rude. So I had to, and I was like, why am I doing this? I'm being censored, and I wanted freedom. So I got a job working for the Sundance Channel, covering the Sundance Film Festival. Uh-huh. And
I bet that was a drop in pay.
It was a big drop in pay, but I got to interview directors who were in competition. And I was like, someday I'm going to be on the other side of this camera. Someday I'm going to do that.
And so how did you make that happen? When did you make a choice to take a step towards that?
Well, it was with Music by Prudence. I quit my job at CNN. I had heard about Prudence. I knew I wanted to do something in Africa for some reason. I just was drawn to Africa. I'd never been to Africa. And I basically took $5,000 of my own money, got some equipment loaned to me from a Maryland Institute College of Art. And they even gave me an intern and paid for him to come with me. And I went to Zimbabwe and started filming with Prudence. And then the first day I started filming, I just knew it was something special, and I knew it was an amazing story. And I was like, I remember thinking when I came back from interviewing Prudence the first day, I thought, this is the greatest story of my life. It's an amazing story. And she was so fresh and real and honest, and no one had ever allowed her to speak. No one had ever talked to her, tell her story. And
for people who haven't seen Music by Prudence, describe who Prudence is.
Prudence Mabena is a severely disabled girl from Zimbabwe. And in Zimbabwe, disability is considered witchcraft. So she was rejected by her family, by society, by the community, and her mother abandoned her with her grandmother. Because women carry the curse of so if you have a disabled child, it's the woman's fault. And her grandmother sort of took care of her for a little while and taught her to sing, but then couldn't take care of her anymore and took her to her father, who had left her mother and was remarried with kids. Her stepmother just threw her under a tree. She doesn't have arms or legs, so she can't move. She lived in her own feces. She didn't think she was human. She thought she was an animal, and she lived with the animals, and she ate off the ground with the dogs. And she was rescued by a school that rescues disabled kids like this. And they cleaned her up, put her in a wheelchair, and they heard this amazing sound coming from her, and they realized she had this. That was her singing, and she has this incredible, not just singing voice, but a musical ability. She formed a band. and she won a tour of Northern Europe. The band won a competition in Africa. And I heard about her, and I, went over and...
How did you hear about her?
A friend of mine had told me about her because they had won the competition, and they're like, there's this amazing singer in Zimbabwe. And so I wrote to the school, and they sent me a little, I remember I got in the mail a mini DV tape, and it was an interview with Prudence that they had shot at the school and her singing. And I was watching it, and I started to cry because her voice is so beautiful. And I don't know, it was something about her, and I just made arrangements to go to the school. I think within weeks I was on a plane to Zimbabwe.
Here is Prudence Mabena singing in Music by Prudence. And so I can fast forward here. You complete this short film. It gets nominated for an Oscar. And I want to ask you more about that story, but it's kind of set up to that. Somewhere you had a collaborator on the film, Eleanor Burkett, who comes up later in the story. So who was she?
Eleanor was a neighbor of mine upstate, or is, she still is. So she was the one who told me about Prudence. And then I wrote to the school and I got that tape. And then I went to Eleanor. Eleanor was a journalist. She's a writer. And I went to her and I said, since she was teaching she was in the Fulbright program teaching at the University of Zimbabwe. And I said, why don't you produce the film? And I asked her because it's illegal at that time, journalism was officially illegal. So you couldn't bring a camera into Zimbabwe and you couldn't shoot in Zimbabwe. And I said, the only way I could do it is if I go as a teach, like as a, sort of to teach at the university, and I was doing a program, and she's like, well, I don't know. I've never produced anything. I don't know how to do that. And I didn't know her very well. And that's how we got the cameras into the country the first time.
Is going as teachers.
Yes. First time, that was how we got the cameras in the country. The second time, we actually snuck them in under the wheelchair. We drove through the border and we put the equipment under the wheelchairs of the kids because when you cross into the country, they wouldn't search a truck full of disabled children because they're afraid. Because if you touch a disabled child, you will have a disabled child. So they just waved us through. So
it's the 2010 Oscars. You are poised, if you win for Best Short Documentary, you'd be the first Black director to ever win an Oscar in any category. Other Black actors, maybe other roles have won before, but never a Black director. So it's kind of a big deal. And something memorable happens if anyone watched the 2010 Oscars. Can you describe from your perspective what went down?
Well, Eleanor and I had parted ways sort of before we went into post-production, sort of the edit. And it's so overwhelming, the Academy, when you're sort of the whole process from the minute you're nominated, sort of the excitement. But that week and that day is really overwhelming. Everyone kept coming up to me, including HBO, including Sheila Evans, the head of HBO Documentary Films, was like, you're gonna win, you're gonna win. People are saying you're gonna win, and I started to, but you don't want to completely believe it. I started to believe it. So when they called my name, it's a very out of body experience. And I remember literally running to stage and high-fiving people. Like I was on The Price is Right or something. Like high-fiving people as I went down there, like jumping like a little kid. It was very embarrassing. And then, boom, Eleanor came up out of nowhere and sort of stole the speech. And I remember I stood there,
She aired that she had a disagreement with you.
Yes. Well, she said, let the woman speak, was the first line she said. Isn't it just like a man to not let a woman speak? And then she spoke. And I was just sort of stood there smiling, realizing that there were lots of people watching. And then at the end I said, this is for Prudence. It's the only thing I got in, and I had planned with the producers of the Oscars to have Prudence. Prudence was in the audience, and to have a camera ready and on her in case we wanted to cut to her. And then I was in shock pretty much after that happened. sort of for a while. And I didn't really realize how big it was, how much of a media story it was, really until I think it was around 6 or 7 in the morning. I got a call from Ryan Seacrest, producer, saying, "We want you to come on E." And then the phone did not stop ringing. It was crazy. And then I couldn't even walk out of the hotel. I remember I had a meeting that day at CAA, and I couldn't walk out of the hotel because there were paparazzi all waiting for me in front of the hotel.
Oh, my God. I don't think that's ever happened to a short documentary winner before.
It certainly put me on the map. And that night, David Letterman reenacted that moment in his monologue. Jon Stewart did a whole monologue about it. It was they talked about it on The View, on the Today Show. It was the big story in that news cycle. And to me, the greatest honor is that The Simpsons did a whole episode about it.
I did not know that. So that is a wild experience. Like at one point you're one thing, 24 hours later you're known for this weird media fluke. How did you take that on board in your life?
I embraced it, and I said, while people know who I am, I need to get another film off the ground quickly. It's funny because I was invited to a lot of things like retreats, and I actually made a little video of that whole night and the whole moment. My partner, who's not my husband at the time, Casper, made a whole video that we put on our website because we were getting like crazy amounts of traffic on our website. But I was at a retreat not too long after that. I was in a sort of I don't know if you call it like a trust circle. We broke down into groups and we had to sort of say what we feared and what we hoped for and all this kind of stuff. And in my trust circle was Cara Mertes. And she said to me, I was at the Oscars that night and I saw what happened to you and you were so composed and, what are you working on next? So I said...
Cara Mertes, who at the time was head of the Sundance Institute documentary program. So someone who can really help a filmmaker get a film going.
Yes. So I said, I'm thinking of... I want to do something in Africa with LGBT. I don't know. She's like, oh, that sounds great. We have this grant, the CineReach Sundance emergency grant for store. And I told her about Uganda, what was going on with the law in Uganda, and I got a few weeks later I got a email from Sundance saying you got this emergency grant, so I could make my first trip to Uganda.
You said something a little while ago that you were fascinated by Africa. Before you went to Zimbabwe to make Music by Prudence, you'd never been to Africa, but you were fascinated by Africa. And I wanted to dig a little deeper into that. What made you fascinated by Africa?
I felt that a lot of the documentaries and the stories I was seeing coming out of Africa were by non-African filmmakers. And my family's a Gullah family, and the Gullahs are from South Carolina. And the Gullah people are the most sort of African Americans connected to Africa because they still have a lot of the traditions that they bought from it. So I grew up in Philadelphia, but I would spend my summers in South Carolina and very immersed in the Gullah culture. So I always had that strong connection to the continent. But I would see films coming out of Africa, films about Africa that were of course, definitely not made by Africans, but not even made by African Americans. And I wanted to find that connection between Africa and African Americans. I felt a connection, and I wanted to see if that would translate into my film, if there would be some sort of deeper understanding, if it wasn't just about gawking at African poverty or violence, and that it was an uplifting film from Africa, and that it was about an African who took control of their own situation and pulled themselves up out of a very bad situation and sort of shine. I thought Prudence's story was inspiring and not depressing.
So you go off to make what becomes God Loves Uganda. And can you summarize what God Loves Uganda is about?
God Loves Uganda is about American evangelicals' influence in Uganda was over the anti-homosexuality bill, which was a bill that was proposed at the time that was a death penalty for the LGBT community. Death by hanging in Uganda, yeah.
And you wind up focusing a lot on the American missionaries who go to Uganda and are proselytizing there, and who wound up having a big force on the politics and the kind of anti-gay politics in the country. I've heard you describe that part of your fascination with this is that you came from a religious family yourself. Can you elaborate, what drew you to that part of the story as opposed to, focusing on the gay activists in Uganda?
So I grew up in a family of preachers. My father is a preacher, and my uncle, the biggest church in the town I grew up in Pennsylvania, was a member of my family. And but I was never accepted because it was a non-affirming church, and I was never accepted definitely by my father, but also by that community, that religious community. So being a gay man, this was really personal to me. Now, idea.
For you, was that a conflict that took place when you were a kid or an adult?
It started when I was a kid, and I think as an adult, at one point when I was working in television, I made a short for PBS going to sort of confront my father and the religious Black community about being gay and who I am. And it was a painful experience. But that's something that I've always been thinking about and wanting to explore. I still want to explore that. And I think that when you make documentaries, for me, it has to be personal, and you have to be, and I think for anyone, you have to be passionate about it, or you're not going to make it through. I mean, it's just too hard.
Yeah. Did you ever gain any closure in your own personal experience trying to bring this up?
When I made the film for PBS, it was really like a sort of a television segment and an hour show we were doing that was out of Nightline at ABC, but we were producing it for PBS. It's that's where I met Ron Suskind, but
okay.
He's the one who actually convinced me to make this short. So it was called Family Secrets, and I go back and I find my biological father, who was the head deacon of the church, who had an affair with my mother, and I was the secret love child of them. My mother was married, and he was married. So I didn't get closure on that because in a way, I was using that film I thought I was using that film as therapy, and it didn't work. It was it was just a lot of pain and no closure. And so I needed to confront the faith community that I came from, and I think I didn't get closure on it until God Loves Uganda, because God Loves Uganda to me was transformative experience, because Uganda's like my church on steroids. It's like people have deep religious fervor. It's crazy. Everything reminded me of where I came from. The speaking in tongues, the passion and the way everyone, but also the hypocrisy of it all also reminded me of the community I came from. My mother had an affair with the head of the church, and that's what I was. So the hypocrisy of it all. It's also the country that is Google ranked at #1 in Googling gay porn. It's the country has the highest alcohol rate in the world. Alcoholism in the world. But it's this deeply religious country. It also has it has this whole tabloid press with lots of, naked women and has a whole big nightclub scene. It's just like all these contradictions. It's the most religious place, but it's
Texas.
It's like Texas, exactly.
When you were making God Loves Uganda, I read that at some point you were identified as a gay man at a particularly heated moment in Uganda when, that could be a death sentence. There was a well-known activist, David Kato, who had been murdered. And so you left, you got out, you went back to the edit room, and then you realized you had to go back.
Yeah.
What was that experience like?
Well, I had become so obsessed with following these white American evangelicals in Uganda and in Kansas City. It's a place called the International House of Prayer, a mega church. IHOP, yes. Although they lost the lawsuit against IHOP the Pancake House, so now they have to call themselves IHOP KC. So I became obsessed with them, and I really cut a film. My first rough cut was really all about them, and it was so intense and filled with so much hatred, really, that I was lucky enough to go to the Sundance Edit Lab with the project, and my first screening at the Sundance Edit Lab, James Longley,
who made Arakan Fragments, nominated for Academy Award,
who said, "This is Invasion of the Body Snatchers," and and that was like a bell went off. I was like, "Oh my God, this is a horror film," but it was such a hard cinematic assault, and they were, editors were like the advisors who are amazing at the Sundance Edit Lab were like, we can't watch this film. It makes us too angry. It's too. So I was like, I have to put in the other side. There were, and at that point, there was only really one lone bishop in Uganda who was fighting against that sort of way of thinking about religion, that it was, about exclusion, and he was including everyone, and that was Bishop Christopher Sinyanja. So I went back. I realized I had to go back. I didn't want to go back. But I did go back. I had Julie Goldman, my producer, is like, you gotta have really good security. I had great security. I followed Bishop Christopher. And by adding Bishop Christopher, and then there was Reverend Kapia Kayoma, and he was a reverend. He's based in Boston, but he was doing religious research, and he's the one who did the research on the Christian right in America and how they're invading Uganda and other African countries. And he wrote a paper on that because he works for a research organization called Political Research Associates. So I added both of them in the film as an alternative voice, and Kapia Kayoma became the sort of narrator who sort of takes you through the journey, because he had been there and had to flee with his family. And when I did that, it gave the viewer someone to identify with and just not be sort of, freaked out the whole time.
So you said that Making God Loves Uganda finally gave you some closure on your own experiences with the evangelical church. How was that?
It was great, because I realized how irrational and how insane certain ultra-conservative evangelicals are, and that it wasn't, I sort of got rid of that stuff from my childhood, those feelings of rejection. I sort of was, I realized, it wasn't me. It was their problem. It wasn't my problem anymore.
We'll be back in a minute with more from Roger Ross Williams as he discusses his new film, Life Animated. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Pure Nonfiction is brought to you by Sundance Now Club. Watch hundreds of documentaries selected by head curator Tom Powers. Now on Club, you can see The Horse Boy, about parents of an autistic boy who travel from Texas to Mongolia seeking help for their son. You can watch Sundance Now Club on your TV, computer, or mobile device. Go to DocClub.com to sign up for a free trial.
Roger Ross Williams got the idea for his new film, Life Animated, from the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Ron Suskind. His son, Owen Suskind, at age 3, was diagnosed as autistic and stopped talking. But Owen loved Disney cartoons. One day, Ron used a puppet of the Disney character Iago, who's a sidekick in the movie Aladdin, and had a breakthrough with Owen. Ron and Owen described that moment in the film.
And Owen turns to the puppet like he's bumping into an old friend.
I say to him, Owen, how does it feel to be you?
And I said, not good, because I don't have any friends.
Now I'm under the bedspread, and I just bite down hard. You know, and just say to myself, stay in character.
And I said, okay. Owen, when did you and I become such good friends?
And he said, when I watched Aladdin, you made me laugh. And then we talk, Owen and Iago, for a minute and a half. It's the first conversation we've ever had.
Life Animated feels like a departure from Roger's earlier work. Stylistically, he combines home video and contemporary footage of Owen as an adult, mixed with Disney clips and new animation. I asked Roger how he went from making 2 films about Africa to focusing on a story of a suburban American family.
For me, it was really important not to get sort of pigeonholed into making only a specific type of film. And what was happening is I was getting offered anytime someone had some film project in Africa, they would come to me. Oh, same thing. Like if it's either if you're African American, if you're Black, they come to you with Black projects. Like only a Black person can make this film, or only Roger's the expert on Africa. So I didn't want that one thing. I had a I knew Ron Suskind for 15 years. And when he first approached me about Life Animated, I was, I didn't quite get it. And there was one moment, I remember I was screening.
Did he approach you with the idea of making a film?
With the idea of making a film pretty sort of early in the process when he was writing the book. Mm-hmm. But then I was screening God Loves Uganda in Boston, and I met him for breakfast, and he said, I'm close to almost finishing this book, and he described Disney Club to me, and something clicked, and I was like, this is it. This is my next film. I don't know. It just clicked, and it's because.
So what is that Disney Club for people who haven't seen Life Animated?
Disney Club is so Owen Suskind,
the son of Ron Suskind.
Yes. So he lost his ability at 3 years old to speak and connect with anyone, and he watched endless Disney animated films for years and years and years. And his first words he uttered was from The Little Mermaid was, "Just your voice." And his family realized that he was actually absorbing the movies, but not only absorbing the movies, but actually learning about life through the films. And they became Disney animated characters to connect with their son, and they sort of drew him out of the autism. And so Owen, who is an expert on everything. He's memorized every line of dialogue from every classic Disney film ever made. He learned to read by reading the credits. He can tell you can say a name of an actor, a voiceover actor, and he will tell you all the other films they've been in. I mean, he'll give you their resume. So he started a Disney Club in his school, and the school is a school for kids. It's like kind of college for not just people living with autism, but people who struggle with various learning disabilities and learning challenges. And and this club became really popular. And they would watch a scene and then they would discuss it, and they just saw so much more in these films. And it was like, and for me, it was really about. I think it's about that sort of. The power of sort of fables and story. These sort of Disney films are classic stories with classic themes, and they really embrace that, and they use that in their own lives. Ron was sort of telling me about this, what's always attracted me as a filmmaker were, Left Behind, people who've been left behind. Music by Prudence, Left Behind. God Loves Uganda is about people who were left behind, even though I'm focused on the other side, the people who are sort of. And so it was sort of a natural fit for me to tell the story of Owen, but it was important for me to tell it from Owen's point of view, from Owen's perspective, and to try to get into Owen's head and see the world through Owen's eyes. And that was what was really exciting for me.
There's a whole set of interesting challenges here. You're looking at material that's based on a book, but the book that I haven't read the book, but I take it that the kind of key dramatic points of the book have already happened. They're things that were happening when Owen was growing up. Now Owen is an adult. How old was he when you first started working on this?
23.
So I think it's always a challenge for a documentary filmmaker to tell a story that's already happened. How do you evoke the drama of that when it's already happened? And then what you do in your film Life Animated is also tell a contemporary story of what's happening with Owen.
Early on, it was so even before. I think it was either shortly after I started shooting or before I signed on an editor, David Teague, who's a brilliant editor, and we would have a lot of conversations about the challenges about just a whole film that happens in the past and the backstory, but what I realized is that Owen was going through this very transformative year in his life. He was about to graduate from school, move into his own apartment. He had fallen in love, everything that's universal, that everyone goes through.
Right.
So we interwove his sort of move to be independent with the backstory, and in sort of the first part of the film. So we didn't even do that much backstory. We just hit the sort of big moments in the backstory. The first time he spoke, the first time he had a conversation with Ron, when he was bullied at school, and then
certainly helps that Ron Suskind is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and knows how to tell a story himself, so he's a great presence on camera.
Ron is an amazing storyteller who gets paid a lot of money for his speeches around the world, and we didn't want to. One of the things we didn't want to do is lean too much on Ron and telling the story, and we wanted. And Cornelia, who is Owen's mother, is really the sort of heart and of the movie, because she is the most loving, caring mother who has done so much for Owen. And so every time I would interview Cornelia, she would be in tears, and Ron is a professional. Like
right.
So I'm like, Ron, you got to be more human. You can't be so, so this is, you got to, so I took him, actually, when I interviewed Ron, I took him away to their house in New Hampshire, to their lake house, and I spent a few days with him, turned off from the world, so I could really, get him to sort of turn off. So we weren't on Harvard Square where he lives, or in his, we were away from everything, so he can really sort of relax and not be in that sort of Ron mode, which Ron is a.
Now, as you approach this story about an autistic man, what were your thoughts or ideas or understanding of autism coming into it?
I didn't have much of an understanding of autism coming into it. Unlike a lot of people, I didn't know anyone with autism. I don't have any connections in my family. So I was a little uncomfortable at first. And so as I became more comfortable.
And can you describe what made you uncomfortable?
Well, as an Owen, because he's autistic, he doesn't, make eye contact or talk. He talks to you, but it's like, there's sort of this disconnect, and you don't know. I just didn't know how was I going to connect with him. It was just, you're just awkward, and so one of the things we did, Owen spent his life watching a television screen and connecting to characters on a television screen. So I thought I should interview him using an Interrotron. And an Interrotron is a camera invented by Earl Morris that is behind a television screen. So you're filming someone through the screen and they're looking at the audience directly.
Owen is looking at Roger's face on a TV screen, and behind that screen is a camera filming Owen.
So that way, Owen can look me in the eyes and really connect. And it was, and I didn't know if it would work. I was amazed by how he was so connected to me, and he was so engaged. And I think my goal with that was for Owen to connect to the audience, to also connect with Owen. And that slowly over the course of the movie, you will get deeper and deeper into Owen's head, so that by the end, when you're in what we call the sidekick story, which we can talk about, you're in Owen's world. Mm-hmm. You're immersed in Owen's world.
Now, you described before that one thing that happens in the course of your filming is Owen falls in love and has romance. And I won't give anything away, but like anyone who's going through a romance, it's a vulnerable thing to film. And it made me wonder, if you're filming a non-autistic person going through a romance or going through something vulnerable, they might have a little bit more of agency to negotiate with the camera or to say, hey, don't film this, or let me collect my thoughts. And Owen is a person who just puts it all out there. Ron is described as like a person who cannot tell a lie. So when you're watching him go through these vulnerable moments, you feel like you're experiencing something with your nerve endings directly exposed. And I wonder if the thought process you went through in filming that with him, capturing those things on camera.
Yeah, there were times where I didn't know whether to film or not, but I let Cornelia and Ron sort of be my guide with that. Mm-hmm. And, it was really important to them to show that people living with autism experience the same things. Maybe it's just the stakes are higher and they're more intense, but the same things that we all experience. And so I, and yes, Owen has no bubble. There's we all live with a bubble around us that we use to protect ourselves and project. And from Owen doesn't have that bubble. He's just raw and exposed. And both Ron and Cornelia and myself thought that it was important to show how Owen is. It's a joy to be around Owen because he doesn't have that bubble around himself, because he just says and expresses how he feels. And that's such a refreshing thing in this world.
In the film, Ron talks about finding Owen's notebook filled with drawings of Disney sidekicks. Here's a clip with Owen explaining the book, followed by Ron's voice.
At that point, I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a sidekick. The sidekicks are fun-loving, comical, wacky, playful, friendly, and delightful. And they help the hero fulfill their destiny. And they support the heroes.
On the last 2 pages, in his scrawl, I am the protector of the sidekicks. And the last thing he writes on the last page is, no sidekick gets left behind.
So there's 2 types of animation in the film. There's what we call the backstory animation, and those are sort of line drawings, like drawings in a sketchbook, like black and white line drawings. And then there's the sidekicks, and that's this Owen creates when Ron discovers one of Owen's sketchbooks, and he writes, I'm the protector of sidekicks. And he realizes that in his sketchbook, Owen was only drawing sidekicks and never drawing heroes. And he relates to sidekicks, and he uses the sidekicks as his advisors in his life. And they are always with him. So when you're with Owen, and you see a lot of this in the film, Owen is always constantly self-talking, and what he's doing is he's doing dialogues from all these Disney films. They're constantly going in his head. So there's this constant, all these characters are all living inside him and all sort of talking to him. And in many ways, I wanted to bring that to life. I wanted to bring the story of the sidekicks. Owen writes a story about this little boy who at 3 years old, which is when Owen was struck with autism, gets lost in a terrible storm in a forest and wanders across this bridge, and the bridge collapses, and he's in the land of the lost sidekicks, where all the sidekicks live because the heroes have fulfilled their destiny and they're without heroes. And many of us feel like sidekicks ourselves, and I definitely feel like a sidekick. So, it was about bringing that story to life, and so I went to this amazing. I love 2D animation that the French are doing. I think they're sort of like doing the best 2D animation work. I wanted it to be very different from Disney, the animation. So I went to Paris and worked with these amazing French animators and created, brought Owen's story to life. So the story that we tell in the film in 3 parts, it's like a little animated film within a film, is, the story of the boy lost in the land of the lost sidekicks, and then Owen creates these monsters, and these monsters, the one in the film is Fuzzbutch, and Fuzzbutch is a monster that makes you confused, that breathes fire and fog into your head and makes you confused. It's autism, and he attacks the boy and his sidekicks and destroys them, and the boy has to find his strength to and use everything he's learned to overcome the sort of challenges and face the world. And that's basically the story that we tell. And Owen created that story. And so, so our what I wanted to do was, I think in the film, by the time you get to the first sidekick animation, you're ready to go deeper into Owen's head. So it comes about maybe close to a third of the way, and you go into this world, and the world it's not the black and white backstory animations, it's in vivid color, and it's this world of fantasy, and it's immersive. There's very little dialogue. It's all about the sound, which we mixed at Skywalker, and I also wanted for the sound, I wanted a composer who could identify with Owen's world. So I found a 23-year-old, brilliant Dylan Stark, 23-year-old, remember that name, 23-year-old electronic music genius who took Owen's self-talking, the sound of VHS tape, fast forwarding and rewinding, all these sounds, and merged it into a unbelievable soundtrack. And we mixed it at Skywalker, and it was like heaven doing that. But it's as much as a sound tells the story as much as the images.
The film had its world premiere at the Sundance Film Festival in January. Owen and his family were at Sundance. They've been to other screenings. What has that experience been like for Owen?
I think it's been life-changing for Owen. Owen thrives. We didn't know this, but we soon discovered Owen thrives in front of an audience. He understands, maybe from watching all these films, what it means to sort of perform. He has just thrived and just loves it. And I think, I don't know, I mean, just there was one at Full Frame, I couldn't even speak in the Q&A because I was in tears because it was so moving to see how happy he was and how happy his parents are, despite everything they've been through to get to that point, that there was over 1,000 people cheering Owen on as he made his bows on stage. That was just amazing to me.
I want to thank Roger Ross Williams for joining me. His new film, Life Animated, is playing in theaters this summer. On our next episode, I talk to Heidi Ewing and Rachel Grady, the directors behind the documentaries Jesus Camp and Detropia. Their new film is Norman Lear, Just Another Version of You, about the pioneering television creator behind shows like All in the Family and The Jeffersons. Thanks to the Pure Nonfiction team, series producer Michael Scotti Jr., sound mixer Kyle Murphy, marketing coordinator Sarah Moto, and executive producer Rafaela Nehausen. I'm Tom Powers. If you like what you've heard, the best way to support us is to subscribe on iTunes and leave a review, even a short one. You can read our show notes, learn about live events, and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.